all. Welcome. I'm Daniel Codd. I graduated from the Political Psychology Master's course back in 2019. And since then, I've been volunteering as a research assistant and working on ideas for my PhD application, which has built up the basis of this presentation I'm going to share with you today. So, I am going to take you on a journey through the prejudice research and that's built up over the last 10 years as such, or the more sort of recent developments. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about prejudice and how we can measure it, and then I'll move into the traditional hypothesis of prejudice, which looks at or which views conservatives as being uniquely predisposed to exhibit prejudice. I'll then talk about some of the key research questioning this viewpoint, followed by a brief overview of some of the research that's been built up since. And then I'll summarize with a nice clear statement on the worldview conflict hypothesis, and then how we can synthesize these two bodies of research and some of the debates surrounding what's built up. But first, just imagine you're at a pub. I want you to imagine a scenario. Imagine you're at the pub and there's a guy at the bar ranting about how human-caused climate change is a hoax. Now, I imagine most of you would probably disagree with this person's point of view, but let's say he seems mildly informed, he's read a few papers, he's arguing against the quality of the research, but he's still saying this is a hoax. Now, yeah, I imagine most of you are going to disagree. So I asked the question of, how do you feel towards this person? Do you want to be this person's friend? Do you feel warm or cold? How would you feel if if your best friend wanted to start dating him? Now, these are all kind of measures of prejudice. Obviously, we've got our explicit measures of like really specific prejudices that we're used to, such as racism and sexism. But in general, prejudice can be viewed as the negative evaluation of a group or its members based on group membership and the characteristics of that group at play. And in most of the research, it's measured using these thermometer ratings. It's measured using thermometer ratings, so do you feel warm or cold, favourable, unfavourable, or also social distance ratings. So how would you feel if this person was your friend, your neighbour? How would you feel if your child married this person? So that brings us to the traditional hypothesis, which, as I said, views prejudice as uniquely related to conservatism. So this has been found over and over and over again in the research dating as far back as 1950s, that typically conservatives are prejudiced, whereas liberals aren't. And by liberals, we mean sort of like left-wing American liberal sense, whereas conservatives are right-wing. And there are multiple theories to explain these findings, but they all typically rely on the evidence that conservatives are more likely to be intolerant of ambiguity, prefer order and structure, and be more sensitive to threat. And so it's hypothesized that these kind of personality traits kind of motivate conservatives to, when they're exposed to someone who is a bit ambiguous or who kind of contradicts their view of the world, it provides a psychological threat, and the prejudice serves as a function to create some psychological distance between themselves and the threat. Whereas liberals, who aren't as threatened by these people or these viewpoints or things that don't quite make as much sense to them on the surface, they're not motivated to act with prejudice. But there's theoretical and experimental evidence that bring this viewpoint into question. So the previous research on prejudice focused typically on prejudice towards racial, religious, and sexual minorities. And these groups are typically low status or socially non-conforming. They're also typically viewed as being liberal. And so the researchers, Chambers, Schlenker, and Collinson, proposed or mentioned that the previous research doesn't actually allow us to test whether the prejudice is caused by any immutable characteristics of the target groups, or if it's because conservatives are prejudiced towards them based on their political positions. So this value conflict. So the prejudice gap might actually be a product of our choice of targets rather than the unique psychology of conservatives. And so they conducted 3 studies to kind of test this hypothesis. The first one really looked at trying to establish whether or not this value conflict was actually associated with levels of prejudice. And then the studies 2 and 3 looked at how race would affect prejudice once we controlled for the political ideology of the targets. So if conservatives really were more racist than liberals, they would presumably be prejudiced towards African American conservatives as well as African American liberals. And so they kind of devised a couple of studies to test that. So study 1, they had participants rate the perceived ideology of 34 different social groups. So they wanted to establish whether or not these groups that are seen in traditional prejudice research actually were perceived as being liberal or left-wing. The participants then gave favorability ratings for each group, followed by their demographic questions, which included their self-reported political ideology, so that they could test whether the perceived ideology of the target group being different from the self-reported political ideology, if that led to prejudice. And this was done in 3 samples. They had an MTech sample, which is an online survey company that tries to build representative samples, or more representative than typical uni samples. But then they also had a student sample, and they had data from the American National Election Survey, which is conducted before and after every major national election in America. And it's essentially the gold standard of survey research. So the results, what did they find? They found the same pattern of results in all 3 samples. They found that the conservatives' mean impression ratings of conservative target groups was higher than that of the conservative mean impression rating of liberal target groups. So conservative preferred conservative groups over liberal groups, but they also found that liberals preferred liberal groups over conservative groups. So this kind of really supported the value conflict hypothesis, that this conflict in values is leading to prejudice. And it seems here that the conservatives are slightly more favourable of their own group and slightly less favourable of the out group than liberals were. But we shouldn't read too much into this from this one study, as I'll talk about a bit going forward. Studies 2 and 3 tried to tease out the effects of race. So in study 2, they had 67 European American adults, which isn't particularly that many. So we do have to be a little bit careful with the sample sizes. But they had the participants give favorability ratings for 24 different target groups that varied on race, so either European American or African American, who were then either liberal or conservative on each of 6 different topics. So participant, they would have been asked for their favorability ratings of, say, a European American who was liberal on welfare, followed by an African American who was conservative on welfare, and then an African American who was liberal on welfare, and then a European American who was conservative on welfare for all 6 issue topics. And this was the race and attitude position was randomized within the topic. But this is quite easy to kind of see what the researchers are really getting at. It's quite easy to give the socially desirable answer. So study 3 was designed to kind of make up for these shortcomings. So they had 152 European American adults, and participants gave the favorability ratings of 1 of 4 targets. So either an African American or European American who was either liberal or conservative on all 6 issues. So participant 1 might have rated an African American who was liberal on all 6, and participant 2 might have rated a European American who was liberal on all 6, and so on and so on. So what did they find? Again, so let me just move that. So they found the same pattern of results in both studies. Again, they replicated the finding that value conflict led to prejudice. So conservatives preferred conservative groups over liberal groups, and liberals preferred, liberals over conservatives. But they found that race had no effect. And they even tried controlling for a measure of modern racism, and found that this actually just made the difference between conservatives' ratings of conservatives and liberals greater, but didn't have any impact on race. So this is, again, we do have to be a little bit careful with the view that race had no impact on prejudice. This is just one study, and that aspect of this study would have to be replicated before drawing any strong conclusions, but it would be huge if true. Either way, it provides this kind of, both studies provide clear evidence in favor of the value conflict hypothesis again. No. Now, while Chambers, Schlenker and Collinson were conducting their studies, unbeknownst to them, two other psychology labs were conducting research, essentially the same research, but operationalized this slightly differently. So Crawford and Polanski looked at political intolerance instead of liking or disliking. Political intolerance is the desire to deny democratic rights to your opponents or to a group in general. And they looked at this towards those who threatens the security and safety of one's own group. And Weverill, Brent and Rayner looked at the willingness to discriminate against those who violate your moral values. But essentially all three psychology labs were looking at how do those across the political aisle react to those whose worldviews conflict their own. And the results, they all found the same pattern of results. Both conservatives preferred conservative groups over liberal groups, and liberals preferred liberal groups over conservative groups. Now, this is the Chambers, Schlenker and Collinson study, which sees that great big difference between conservatives and liberals, but the other two studies found very similar patterns of results. And much of the literature elsewhere also finds very similar effect sizes between the two. Now, one of the things we have to realize here is we've had three independent labs who were conducting essentially the same research at the same time without talking to each other. And so this is a huge marker of the validity and reliability of the research, especially in a field known for its replication crisis. So the further research that's built up since then, we also find similar patterns in the social and economic dimensions of ideology. So you can break ideology down into its social components, which is kind of how other people should live, and economic is your views on how the economy should be run. And the important thing with this research was found that the prejudice was related within domains. It was restricted to being within the domain of ideology. So social liberals were prejudiced towards social conservatives, but not economic conservatives. And economic conservatives were prejudiced towards economic liberals, but not social liberals. And this has been repeated in Poland as well. So a large number of participants, replicated a couple of times. Similar patterns of results I've also found in the way liberals and conservatives react to information, also known as political bias. So both liberals and conservatives prefer information or data that reaffirms their own worldview. So they're more likely to expose themselves to, remember, and they're more likely to rate higher the scientific methodology of studies that support their that the conclusions support their worldview rather than contradict. So yeah, this kind of is built up into the worldview conflict hypothesis, which, as I kind of said, the worldview conflict hypothesis is the view that conservatives aren't uniquely uniquely predisposed to exhibit prejudice, but rather that individuals across the aisle have a broad, generalized prejudice towards those who hold worldviews that conflict with their own. And this has been found to a similar degree in conservatives and liberals, in social and economic dimensions, in multiple cultures, using multiple measures of prejudice and intolerance, using multiple study designs. And it just shows just how important it is to incorporate a vast array of different targets when studying broad psychological concepts. So how can we synthesize these two strands of research? Well, for one, the traditional hypothesis wasn't wrong as such. The evidence supporting it also supports the worldview conflict hypothesis. But the conclusions that were drawn from it might need to be taken with a grain of salt, because it only really showed one half of the side of the story of prejudice. Some researchers also question whether this worldview conflict should really be considered prejudice at all, because to them, prejudice is a social ill, it should cause social harm, and should be unjustified. Whereas to some researchers, liberals' prejudice towards conservative groups is justified, because conservatives typically try to deny or are prejudiced towards traditionally oppressed groups. And so it's kind of seen as punching up a little bit, and that liberals are trying to defend the rights of oppressed minorities. And this is a valid concern. Some researchers warn us away from drawing a moral equivalence between the two, which is an important criticism to keep in mind. But I think the two worldviews and the two forms of prejudice can be looked at and held true together. For example, it's important to understand both the broad understanding of prejudice and the individual specifics. And if you want to implement interventions to reduce prejudice, it's important to know what it is that's actually causing the prejudice in the first place. You want the cure to match the diagnosis, and the diagnosis to be right if you're going to have any hope of curing it. So that leads to future research. Where can we go with this? For one, the core motivators of this conflict prejudice aren't completely understood at this point, and it's entirely possible that they differ across the aisle. And so if we want to reduce prejudice in conservatives versus liberals, we might need different interventions. And so that would be really important to know. And it's also it could also be really interesting to study the effect of dissent within political tribes. So if we're prejudiced towards those who hold different worldviews, what happens when someone who largely holds our worldview contradicts that worldview? Are we even more prejudiced towards that person, or do they affect our views? That might be really interesting to study as well. So thank you very much. Any questions? I guess that's it. You there? I can't hear you, Laura.
Be good if I turned that on. You do have a question in the chat function. Do you want me to read it out?
Oh yeah. How do I see the chat as well?
Just next to where you press share screen, the bottom.
Oh yeah. It moves to the top when you're sharing screen.
Oh.
This is right. Other than generalized prejudice, racism, homophobic sexism, if prejudice can be understood as conflict of values, would it be appropriate for us to shut down conservatives? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by shut down conservatives. Do you want to just quickly clarify what you mean there?
Hi, I used shut down as kind of because I was thinking that you'd not see my question and then leave the recording, but for lack of a better word, I kind of just meant that in places like universities where I guess more people tend to be liberal, there is kind of like the assumption that people who are conservative and have conservative views are going to be these people who are racist and sexist and homophobic. So where prejudice in conservatives can be seen as a conflict of values, would it be appropriate for us to kind of, I think right now, especially in places like universities, we don't really listen to conservative views because we kind of assume that they'd be like that. So would it then be appropriate for us to take a different approach and be like, actually, I see what you're kind of trying to say, but that goes against my values, so can we think about it differently?
Yeah.
That was very muddled, really sorry.
No, absolutely. I think one of the things we find is that, so there's been some research done into how we can reduce this prejudice between the two. And one of the things that was found was that by including the out group in the conversation, we reduce prejudice. So by letting someone come into this conversation and talk about their viewpoint and kind of ask questions and other things like that, we can kind of reduce a little bit of prejudice. I think one of the other things is as well is that there's also been studies that have been done that look at more sort of like political leaders and the prejudice towards political leaders. If you just give information on where they stand on the issue, the prejudice is much higher than if you also give biographical information. So I think part of this could be how much do we view someone, a conservative, as just like an avatar of their political ideology, and how much do we view them as a human being with their own wants and goals, and arguably the same goals, they just might want to go in a different way about getting it. So if we can incorporate people into the conversation more, if we can sit down, take a step back and say, okay, I want to actually listen to what you have to say and understand your motivations for what you're saying, and if I can come to view you as a fully formed human being with wants and goals and dreams and family members, rather than just an avatar for your like ideology, like just a representative of a conservative who opposes what I want. If we can come to see someone as more of a fully fledged human being, then I think that might, yeah, I think that might help reduce this conflict. It might help reduce this prejudice we see across the aisle, and might actually help all of us come together and actually come up with like shared collective solutions to the problems we face. I think ultimately we need everyone on board in these conversations, because conservatives make up like 50% of the population, liberals make up 50% of the population. No one group is going to be able to solve it on their own. And even if they did solve it, they would need to get the other side on board. So I think we could do with having much better conversations about this. Thanks.